Brendan Fay is an assistant professor at Eastern Michigan University, where he teaches modern and contemporary art history in the School of Art and Design. He earned his Ph.D. from Harvard in 2009, with a focus on photography, abstraction, and photographic education in the United States. His writing has appeared in History of Photography, Art Forum, Exposure, and the Detroit-based website Infinite Mile. Brendan serves as a member of the Minor White Project Committee at the Princeton University Art Museum. In cooperation with the Moholy-Nagy Foundation, he is also, he has in parentheses, slowly, working on a catalog raisonné of color photographs by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. Please welcome Brendan Fay.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Julia and Charles, for the extraordinary hospitality here. It's really fantastic to see Portland, to see the show, to see the beautiful museum. Thank you, Kate, for the inspiration to bring us all together. And since I'm in a thanking mood, thanks everybody for the time and attention today. Quick caveat first. I've stolen my title from the 19th century photographer Peter Henry Emerson, who writes a very dogmatic treatise called Naturalistic Photography for Students of the Art. And I'm not going to talk about Emerson, and I'm not going to apologize. Other than that, here we go. This talk examines Minor White's efforts as a writer and teacher in the 10 years following his departure from Portland, roughly 1943 to 1953. We'll be looking at a small number of White's Oregon-era photographs and the second lives they start to live within an important collection of published and unpublished writings. White's Oregon photographs give us a through line, a thread to follow through a messy, unruly, and generative period in his career. They give us a narrow cross-section through a much larger retrospective process. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, White began a process of sorting and sifting through his work to date, pulling apart old projects and sequences, and reshuffling and reorganizing his existing pictures in order to illustrate his evolving theories of photography and to support his evolving practice as an artist. By retracing his steps, we can isolate aspects of the process by which the Minor White of Front Avenue and the downtown YMCA evolved into the Minor White of Aperture magazine and beyond. We'll proceed by way of 3 episodes, 3 instances where Oregon pictures get mixed into White's rapidly growing corpus of articles and book manuscripts. At each stop, I'll try to work somewhat backward, describing how White uses his Oregon photographs, what he aims to accomplish in these texts, and where those concerns emerge from a broad set of early influences. Let me begin somewhere in the middle. A reader paging through the 1952 American Annual of Photography would have encountered, somewhere near the middle of the volume, 2 of Minor White's Oregon photographs. You know them now from Ian's talk. They were about 10 years old at the time. One, from the spring of 1941, shows the cracked and furrowed earth of a farm in the Grand Ronde Valley in northeast Oregon. Another, from the winter of the same year, presents a partially solarized view of the distant Wallowa Mountains, seen from the Anthony Lakes. The first was included in White's landmark 1969 publication, Mirrors, Messages, Manifestations, and the second in Peter Bunnell's 1989 retrospective, The Eye That Shapes. Both photographs, in other words, have gone on to play a role in the public representation of White's early years. The American Annual of Photography was a yearly book format publication issued by the publishers of American Photography, a monthly popular interest photo magazine. In keeping with the magazine's general approach, the 1952 annual offered up a mishmash of disparate topics and points of view. Texts on Paul Strand and the Story of Tintypes by Walter Rosenblum and Beaumont Newhall, alongside technical articles on portrait lighting, soft focus lenses, and photomicrography, not to mention stereo pendulum patterns, alongside a listing, a telling one for our purposes, of who's who in pictorial photography. This is part of the long hangover of pictorialism Ian referred to earlier. Within this mix sat White's article, called The Use of Space in Designing Pictures. His article aimed to describe 5 varieties of space, or depicted depth, that could be found in photographs. He was always teaching. He illustrated these varieties with 8 of his own pictures, incorporating these 2 Oregon scenes alongside more recent work. The 2 Oregon pictures, not surprisingly, both illustrate kinds of deep space. In the moderately deep Cove Ranch photograph from the Grand Ronde Valley, White's text highlights the continuous incline of the ground plane to the middle distance. In the deep Wallowa Mountains photograph, he emphasizes the comparable incline of the sky. In this latter case especially, White asserts that depth and distance are, quote, primary to the meaning of the print, end quote. And that solarization in the foreground, in the brief explanation he provides in the article, quote, tends to add to the strangeness or to a thought that the present world is not so fine as one somewhere else. As one slowly recognizes how far away the mountains are, the meaning becomes felt, end quote. Many of us gathered here today will recognize White's trademark interpretive habits, even in that quick gloss. His constant leaning toward the metaphoric, the symbolic, the revelatory or spiritual. So it's worth remembering, on the one hand, that the first issue of Aperture has yet to be compiled at the time this article appears. And it's worth suspecting, on the other, that White has more in mind than a simple lesson in descriptive vocabulary. Indeed, White's declared goal was not merely to differentiate these varieties of space, but, beyond that, to organize them into a system for the critical analysis of photographs. Early in the article, White asks, how many kinds of space are possible in photographs? But then he continues, quote, how do these relate to the emotional response of the spectator? What do they reveal of the photographer's temperament? End quote. We suddenly face 3 problems instead of 1, a somewhat taller order. White's underlying goal, as it starts to show through here, was a single system that could organize, 1, the visual qualities of photographs, the basic elements of style, 2, typical spectator responses to each of those visual qualities, their basic emotional content, and 3, the personal qualities that might shape a photographer's style, leading them toward a particular kind of image. Isolating space as one such formal variable, as a test case, he offered up what he called a ring diagram. Isn't that cute? Arranging his 5 modes in circular formation, from deep to moderate to opening, to limited to fluctuating, and back to deep again, White marked out a set of points on a larger continuum, a system of differences without dead ends or binary oppositions. White insists in the text that these represent, quote, possibilities no one of which is any better or worse than any other, end quote. A set of equally valid options available to any photographer. That's what the Oregon pictures are here for, to demonstrate White's own use of everything he describes. And that's also, I think, why they're published without dates, to avoid any developmental narrative among the pictures or the modes. And yet, he also tips his hand, revealing his own current preoccupations, when he notes that his ring format is, quote, chiefly valuable because the job of cataloging photographs that are unscaled or fluctuating is made easier, end quote. This was, we have to imagine, a more pressing concern for White than it was for his average reader. Let me put this another way. We see one of White's most characteristic strategies at work here, an attempt to build a receptive audience for his photographs by propounding a comprehensive theory for all photography. By the late 1940s, he was deeply invested in unscaled photographs and fluctuating spaces, as showcased in his famous 4th sequence, which begins with the image on your right. He loved the way an unfamiliar texture or surface detail could oscillate, shifting from human scale toward the telescopic or microscopic. He also loved the way that ambiguity could delay or prevent one's recognition of the original subject. And the wraparound logic of White's ring diagram accommodates such seemingly abstract photographs without having to treat them as an exception, as violations of some basic principle of photography. It was a clever solution to a problem he'd been pondering for at least 5 years, since encountering one important model for what a total theory might look like. So we rewind to 1945. Discharged from military service in the fall of that year, White had traveled to New York City, where he first met the historians and curators, Beaumont and Nancy Newhall, who we've spoken of today, and through them, a number of major photographers. But he also enrolled in seminars with the venerable art historian Meyer Shapiro through the Extension Division at Columbia. Shapiro introduced White to one of the foundational texts in the field of art history, the German scholar Heinrich Wülfen's Principles of Art History. Wülfen's famous treatise had redefined the study of the Baroque, treating it not as a decline from some pinnacle in the Italian High Renaissance, but as a separate visual language corresponding to a separate worldview. Quote, neither a rise nor a decline from the classic, as Wülfen put it, but a totally different art. In White's understanding, Wülfen offered a system for describing differences in style without presuming or assigning differences in value. It struck White with the force of a revelation. There are lots of reasons for that, I think, but one factor had to be his range of early experiences. His own work in landscape, architectural documentation, portraiture, theater, his involvement with WPA documentation and camera clubs, his acquaintance with F-64 and pictorialism. He already had a strong leaning toward the so-called straight photography of Weston or Adams, but recognized other desires in his own work and clearly felt an obligation to speak toward a broader field. With Shapiro's encouragement, and we must say Shapiro's reservations, White set out to rewrite Wülfen's system for the analysis of photographs. Wülfen's arguments were built around 5 sets of opposed terms or principles, the most famous being his contrast between the so-called linear style of Raphael and the painterly style of Rubens. He likewise contrasted the classic treatment of space as a series of receding planes with the continuous recession typical of the Baroque. In White's student papers, he began renaming some of Wülfen's principles and expanding or supplementing others, partly to deal with problem cases like the photogram. But at the core of his project, he also made a more drastic departure, deliberately removing the history from Wülfen's Principles of Art History. Wülfen had been concerned with changes in style over time, and he sought to locate individual styles within the constraints of period style. He insisted that, quote, not everything is possible at all times, end quote. White substituted a concern for the range of competing styles within his own time, his sense that nearly everything was indeed possible at once. In place of Wülfen's attention to the constraints of history, White began to substitute the constraints of medium. The Principles of Art History inspired White to begin constructing an analytical system, but White could never really bring himself to stay within the limits of his model. To understand why, consider a second appearance by White's Oregon-era photographs. In 1951, readers of the monthly issues of American Photography, rather than the annual, would once again have encountered White's farmland photograph from Eastern Oregon. It was in the July issue, in the second of a series of 4 articles White published that year. In the first article from May, it was preceded by 2 more images from 1940 and 41, another farmland scene plus a somewhat soft-focus studio portrait. Unlike White's space article, with its sense of openness and its tone of neutral description, a very different and more prescriptive set of ideas will unfold across this series of texts. In the May article, titled Your Concepts Are Showing, 2 early pictures are called upon to illustrate a quote-unquote painterly approach to photography. In a studio portrait of the actress Barbara Spencer, White finds painterly qualities in his own use of dramatic lighting, staged or contrived pose, and matte printing. In the view of a rural farmhouse, White instead finds painterly qualities in a posterize effect, achieved through infrared film, and then secondarily in the internal framing provided by the trees, and in the reflections offered by the foreground pond. White's definition of painterly turns out to be extraordinarily broad. It begins from the typical markers of pictorialism, like soft focus images and hand-manipulated prints. But over the course of the series of articles, it absorbs nearly any approach where a photographer interacts with their subject, say by composing a still life or directing a model. And it absorbs any approach that extends the photographer's creative process and decision-making past the moment of exposure. That means cropping. It means layout and sequencing. It means exploration of the negative during printing. It means solarization, reticulation, and other darkroom trickery. It's a remarkable construction, a single category that basically equates pictorialism with photojournalism, with modernist experimentation. In place of painterly, White labels this whole range of approaches the camera as brush concept. The alternative, of course, is the hallowed ground of straight photography and pre-visualization. For the American photography series, White dubs this approach the, quote, camera as extension of vision. When our Grand Ronde photograph reappears, it's in the July article, telling us that it's possible to search exclusively for the revealing moment only in a world left as it is found. It's in an article called How to Find Your Own Approach to Photography, as one example of an approach based on vision. White's language here tacks on some echoes of Wülflin, aligning this vision approach with a love of things as they are, and aligning the brush approach with things as they become. But to a certain extent, he's playing with a very familiar, time-worn opposition. White's particular twist is to gather all that up and subject it to a double identification. On the one hand, he wants to identify each approach with a particular kind of person. There are brush people and there are vision people, so to speak. Those drawn to tinker and touch, and those drawn to reflect and observe. He counsels the magazine's readers to locate themselves within that scheme and choose the methods characteristic of their personalities. On the other hand, he also wants to identify each approach with a particular kind of camera, starting from a broad distinction between the view camera and the quote-unquote miniature camera, by which he means any handheld camera that shoots roll film instead of sheet film. He aims to, quote, keep us on the path of the characteristic use of each, end quote. Now, vision obviously belongs to the view camera, am I right? So White advances the curious argument that the painterly or brush attitude finds its natural outlet in something like the Leica. There's something funny about this, about linking the photojournalist's essential tool with a frustrated desire to paint. But White has an underlying logic, laid out in the third article of the series. Roll film limits exposure control, since every frame on a roll receives the same development. That precludes true pre-visualization, so printing becomes an exploratory step of its own. And if you're going to shoot first and see later, what better tool than a mobile camera that lets you immerse yourself in experience? Characteristic is White's guiding keyword here. He's trying to advance a theory of medium alongside a theory of creative practice, and do it all with a single pair of terms. He wants the distinction between brush and vision to encompass the characteristic uses of cameras. He also wants those terms to explain what makes photographs characteristic of their makers. Making versus seeing neatly mapped onto miniature versus view. Now, as you might imagine, given White's deep connection to view camera traditions, this doesn't always feel like a fight between equals. At several points, he warns that the brush inclination, taken to its extremes, is likely to lead a photographer into frustration or out of photography. Vision, by contrast, is wrapped in the glowing language of absorption and awareness, faithfulness and creative freedom, sympathy, respect, revelation. The wonderfully complicated subtext is that White illustrates both approaches through the full series of 4 articles, entirely with his own work. Is this a self-refuting argument, or is something else happening here? I'm inclined to see an indication of the sources and inspirations and conflicts and contradictions he's struggling to synthesize at this moment. So let me retrace a timeline for a few minutes, because 1951 is a year of firsts for White. It's the year when many of his long simmering ideas first make it to publication, to press. But it's also the moment when he definitively begins using his own photographs to present those ideas. The linkage happens across 6 published articles, most of which I've touched on here, but they're really the tip of an iceberg. In 1946, White moves from New York on the left to San Francisco on the right. You were looking at the Weston Retrospective, White's adoring, loving photographs of the Newhall's Weston Retrospective at MoMA in 1946, and then Lisette Modell, his sometime partner in crime, out shooting in San Francisco in 1946, later in the year. He began teaching at the California School of Fine Arts with Ansel Adams, who quickly skipped town. By 1947, he was in pursuit of a master project he called space analysis. The project claimed an extraordinary amount of White's attention over the next 5 or 6 years. especially as it became deeply integrated with his classroom teaching. For the same reason, its exact parameters were constantly changing. White used his students as guinea pigs and collaborators. They encountered the Wulfflin system as both assignment and tool, as a set of requirements for picture making and as a method for print interpretation. In letters and notes from 1947 and 1948, White imagines illustrating his masterpiece book to be with a mix of his own photographs and photographs made by his students. For a short phase, in 1948, he reimagines the book as an analysis of canonical images, illustrations by Strand, Adams, Stieglitz, and the usual suspects, and imagined the students, instead, as model readers and viewers. They would be the source of emotional responses, rather than the makers of illustrations. And the students remained in that role when White returned to the idea of illustrating with his own photographs, sometimes later in 1948. You can see where those 1951 articles are coming from at this point, yes? But there are a few more ideas we need in the mix. Some were emerging ideas, some were recurring ones. On the emerging side, 1948 and 1949 found White nearly obsessed with small format photography. His students were pressing him for technical instruction beyond the view camera. He wanted to figure out whether miniature work could match the expressive range of the view camera and whether he could absorb it into his Wulfflin system. White's distinction between view cameras and miniature cameras comes straight out of the landmark volume published by Beaumont Newhall in 1938. This is one of the great groundbreaking moments in the kind of history of photography, the study in the US. The idea first appears in White's writings somewhere between 1942 and 1945 in the unpublished manuscript 8 Lessons that Todd referred to earlier. But it shapes his work as an artist in the late 1940s, with the sequence Intimations of Disaster as one important outcome. You'll see much of this effort gathered up in Exploratory Camera, the lead article that opens the inaugural issue of Aperture. On the recurring side, we can look back to a Guggenheim proposal that White submits in 1946. In his proposal of that year, not funded, he signals his ambition to write one or more book-length publications for aspiring photographers. The book, or books, would treat 3 major ideas, each with an obvious source. The first he called Space and Style Analysis. This was a direct continuation of his rewriting or adaptation of Wulfflin's principles. The second idea he called the creative condition. This was about the mental and emotional training of photographers, about inner growth. It was a direct continuation of his rewriting or adaptation of Boleslavsky, as Todd described earlier. And Boleslavsky's dialogue format carries over even into White's 1951 series of articles. He just couldn't shake that template as a kind of writing mode. The third idea in White's Guggenheim proposal was equivalence, or the use of photographs as metaphors. White took the word and the idea straight from Alfred Stieglitz, but he couldn't leave well enough alone. One of White's earliest published texts, as we just discussed, is the 1943 article, When is Photography Creative? There, he offers 2 basic paths for photographers, seeing things in and of themselves and using things to visualize other ideas. Both locate creativity in seeing. So far, so Stieglitz. But then he describes a third kind of creativity that arises with portraiture, the interpersonal, collaborative building of a, quote, mutual feeling between photographer and subject, end quote. A similar idea pops up in a 1948 letter to Nancy Newhall, who was always his closest interlocutor. Quote, I know very well that during the past 2 years, the students have been working out my problems. It's not exactly fair to them, but what can I do? I can't stop creating just because the medium veers from camera to student frequently, end quote. Vision versus involvement. This sounds a lot like the opposition between vision and brush in that 1951 series. White spent the decade of the 1940s trying to build that into a strict either-or choice, with the weight of Newhall and Adams and the straight photographic tradition pressing on him the whole time. So was White a vision guy or a brush guy? I don't think he was willing to choose. And by 1950 or so, he had shifted his approach to illustrating his own arguments. He started gathering up his work to date as a foundation for the work to come. So the Oregon pictures that start to appear in his publications play an aspirational role. They mark a hope that all these branching paths and either-or choices that White was tracing through photography might turn out to be a single path. Episode 3 takes place in the archive and takes us into the pages of a sprawling, unpublished 3-volume manuscript. The manuscript carries the lofty title, Fundamentals of Style in Photography and the Elements of Reading Photographs. In letters, though, White started calling it How to Read Photographs, and he used that title for volumes 2 and 3. It's the closest White gets to integrating all his early concerns in a single place. The most complete copy, at the Harvard Art Museum, contains more than 200 small silver prints attached to its pages. "Just call me the Scotch Tape Kid," he writes to Adams after finishing production in the fall of 1953. 7 of White's Oregon photographs are scattered across the illustrations to this manuscript, and they're typically used to introduce small formal principles. A false Solomon's seal from the eastern hills exemplifies a few varieties of line. Our familiar farm, yet again, illustrates moderate space, receding smoothly but stopping short of the sublime. By contrast, a mountain boulder shows us space organized in planes, with a corresponding sense of obstruction. And another Oregon farm scene in the lower right here shows us what White calls perforated space, depth seen through a kind of screen or grill. In a related image, lower left, we see a farm building as an example of closed shapes and closed forms, compositional strategies that give a picture a sense of completeness unto itself. Line and plane, open and closed form. You can see that White is still using Wolflin's principles as an underlying armature, although he's added another layer of distinctions between small concepts, like texture and line, and large concepts, like space, light, or composition. But another Oregon farm scene in the upper right, with the silly tree there, starts to show what else he's adding to the idea of reading photographs. It says here, "This tree is a kind of clown. It's offered as an example of anthropomorphism, or the projection of human qualities onto inanimate and natural forms." A final Oregon photograph, showing a train and grain elevator near Aliceville, Oregon, serves as a more comprehensive reading exercise and as a major waypoint in this manuscript. It's near the end of volume 2. Here, White uses some creative cropping to model the process of reading, of isolating different formal qualities. You see he's taken 2 diagonal slices in the 2 successive pages there, and he's trying to capture the stasis of the architecture against the implied movement of train and sky. The text follows up with a checklist that notes, beautifully, how space, light, tone, and texture reinforce a first impression of the picture based on movement. He ultimately argues that the picture is about the central place of the grain elevator within all of these vectors of movement that wrap around it, underscoring its importance to an agricultural region. The design, he notes, simply restates what the objects state. Now, by White's own description, this is an easy picture. It's about the things it shows, and it is, quote, easy to stay within its main meaning, end quote. It doesn't pull us toward flights of fancy. As a result, it helps us see what the Oregon pictures are doing in this manuscript, the supporting roles they play, and it helps us see what the manuscript does as a whole. It's a reading lesson for beginners, taken from White's beginnings. It embodies the idea that some photographs do provide us with an experience of their subject matter, and sets up the idea that other photographs might provide us with something else. White ultimately phrases this as a distinction between bridges to experience and sources of experience. Photographs we see through, and photographs we see, complete experiences in themselves. By way of conclusion, let me try to extract a couple things that happen along the way. 1. White's interest in cropping and exploration gets shifted from making to viewing. In the American photography articles, cropping and exploring the negative were linked to a painterly approach. That whole distinction between miniature and view cameras disappears in this later manuscript, while cropping becomes a tool for teaching us to see. But when you turn from the grain elevator to the 3rd volume, that cropping technique, a teaching technique, gets applied to photographs that have had much deeper personal associations for White. There's a portrait of Tom Murphy on the Pacific coast, taken from the series Song Without Words, one of his early meditations on his desire for men. And then there's the concluding image of the 4th sequence, shot on the sacred ground of Point Lobos, You've got the full image in a small thumbnail there upper left, and then sort of different crops he takes through it on successive pages. A sequence that he once summarized as equivalents of sex that were basic as hell. Right? This is like beginner white from his point of view. But the 1953 manuscript totally desexualizes these pictures, and yet also holds them out as places where we should seek deep meanings. 2. White starts to locate the meaning of a photograph in reception, in the viewer's experience of an image. This is an unwieldy idea, and in many ways, White handles it crudely. But he has an interesting argument for what this should mean to photographers. In short, he counsels them to become the best and first readers of their own work. In so many words, he argues that the only way to secure an intentional meaning in a photograph is to treat it as an unintentional object, to hold it at arm's length, to see it as others might see it, and then to own or reject those meanings accordingly. Almost in passing, he suggests that one kind of person might actually possess that sort of omniscient or universal understanding. That person, of course, is the mystic. If you've ever opened a copy of Aperture, you know where this story goes. But White grounds the argument in a personal anecdote and in a singular image. The last of White's photographs to appear in this unpublished 1953 manuscript is Burning Bush, taken in 1946. It's an exposure from near Stinson Beach, taken in his first semester in California. Quote, "The particular photograph above is pure accident," White explains. Quote, "A leak in the bellows caused the light," he continues, and then asks, "Has the photographer the right to show this as his work?" End quote. He answers in the affirmative. Quote, "It is an outright statement of religious mysticism, symbol and all. I can claim it as my own because it is directly in the path of my own direction in photography. It is backed up by many pictures that were not accidents, that were made on purpose with every bit of technique at my command." Directly in the path. That's my basic idea about the afterlife of White's Oregon images. On a surface level, they provided White with a set of illustrations and reading exercises. They help us recognize the scope of the synthesis White felt obligated to provide as he struggled to define creative photography as a field of activity. And they help us recognize the generative contradictions among all those sources he gathered in support of that task. But on another level, they helped him validate his evolving approach, his emerging mystical leanings, by suggesting he'd been walking that path all along. The only way, after all, is the way through camera work. Thank you.
So as a steward of some of Miner's earliest photographs, I think you absolutely prove the point in the way that he looks at them and uses them later more as illustrations than his fully fledged work. Did you find anywhere a sense that he was at all further dismissive of his Oregon work, of not embarrassed by it, but I know oftentimes artists are very unfavorable toward their very early work because they know how immature they are. Did you get a sense that he felt that at any point about these images, or do they just become a different form of his own education that he uses to his advantage later?
I have a slightly different sense of what happens from here. And I have to say, I'm going to go with the tangent first and then the answer second. One of the really glorious things about being here to see this show is realizing just how much I love so many of these early photographs you have on view right now, and just how much the very best pictures he makes in Oregon are not the ones he's using when he's playing around with his work in the 1940s. And I think some of that has to do with the experience of dropping all his negatives in a repository and heading off on a boat. Right, I have sort of an absence of evidence there, so I can't play with the idea much further. But I think there's a kind of bottleneck that all of his work gets squeezed through in the early 1950s. Everything gets put through this kind of formal analysis ringer, is the word I'm looking for. And then he comes out with this sense on the far side I don't know if I've ever thought of it these terms, but Mondrian actually seems apposite here. This sense of all of these works he's built over time as cards in a deck that he can reshuffle and redeploy and put back in play. And there are places, right? We had reference to that article earlier when an Oregon writer was sort of puzzling at sequence 13, this poetic sequence, when it comes here in 1959. And sequence 13 is effectively a remix of the images he includes in this unpublished manuscript, right? There is a sort of template that gets established in the early 1950s with this text that he can never actually get to press, get published, of the career representation as a kind of remix, right? And so even though here it feels like he's turning each of these works into these really kind of dry, like here's space, here's line, whatever, it also frees him up to kind of crack those loose of some of the early sequences, the early projects, right? Here's where this came from, here's how I mixed it the first time, so that everything becomes up for grabs for the next sequence, for the next project, right? For kind of getting mixed and matched. And since I'm rambling anyway, I feel like one of the strange outgrowths of this, I was thinking about this earlier today, there are a lot of early pictures, ones from the show, also just pictures from elsewhere, that are always surprises to me when I encounter them out in the wild. I see that, I'm like, wow, that's a great picture, I didn't recognize that. And then I turn back to Peter Bunnell's catalog, and I realize that it's in there somewhere, and I've just forgotten that he included it. And I think the biggest reason for that is that that book, which is still the book of record on White, follows this mix and match remixing strategy that White had in his own career, right? It's not a chronological catalog, even though it's got the chronological section. And so in a way, I mean, I think Bunnell trained us very intentionally to see the photographs out of order in this kind of everything up for grabs relationship to each other. And it takes some deliberate effort to work from that back to something like strict chronology. Fortunately, Catherine is on the job, so we're going to get there. But
Brendan, I have a question for you about the unpublished manuscript, the 3 volumes.
yeah.
I have 2 questions, hopefully both fairly straightforward. One, do you have any sense from your work of why that 3-volume manuscript remains unpublished? And 2, especially in light of your talk today and my awareness of Minor White's role at Aperture, I'm starting to have a sense that he succeeds greatly with the article and perhaps fails with the book form. And this is just coming off of the thought that this huge tome that's solely illustrated with his own work never makes it to print, and yet we have a 6-part series of articles. And just could you speak to that, or tell me I'm wildly off base?
No,
Thanks.
I think that's a beautiful way of describing the state of affairs. I think that's totally accurate. Just in case he's watching on YouTube right now, I will go ahead and say that I'm allowed to say this because Peter said it once. I think part of the problem was that White was kind of a terrible writer, right? I mean, he worked extraordinarily hard at it, and that kind of didactic writing was not his genuine talent. Right, and I say this as somebody who has devoted years of my life to reading White's words. He was just not the best writer out there. And in some way, right, my fascination with him is actually not because I think he got it all figured out in the end. I think he's fascinating precisely because he was somebody who was so dedicated to the search, whether he ever actually got to the answers or not, right? I mean, there's this kind of just open-ended, unfinished quality to everything he does. And as you start to plow through the archive, right, we've each kind of picked in different portions of it. Other people have worked through different years. It's like he's always got this albatross at any given moment in his life, right? There's always the unpublished and unpublishable book in progress sitting next to him wherever he goes. And I think each one of those unpublishable books just kind of evolves into the next unpublishable book manuscript somewhere. It's like he could do the photograph and the sequence and the article and the magazine itself, right? Aperture is his kind of total work of art. But the book with the compact arc, he couldn't quite swing, and I think part of it is that in 1953, it's because he hasn't decided which book he wants to write or which argument he wants to make, right? Is he teaching formal analysis, or is he teaching deep spiritual self-growth through contemplation of photographs? He doesn't know, right? He wants both at the same time, and he's got no idea how to manage that. I couldn't either. I feel like that was most of the question. Are there parts of the question I've missed
Or
there?
just if you have found any evidence that he was sort of actively soliciting any publishers
He sent this manuscript out to publishers.
Okay, and the Harvard one, the one that's now at
Yeah,
Harvard.
the Harvard
okay.
one. He tries sending that out, and people are like, thanks, no thanks.
And that was so people do respond, and they just sort of say thanks, but no thanks.
Yep. And I think on some level, right, again, sort of aperture rather than a book becomes the consummation of this. On some level, he wants this really didactic, teacherly book to be an actual instructional volume and also be a kind of sequence and image text combination all at the same time. Like he wants it to sort of be a lesson and a work of art all at once, and that's a pretty tall order. I mean, like Stephen Shore gets a little bit of that, but I think sets his sights a lot lower when he publishes The Nature of Photographs. So,
Thanks.
yeah, thank you.
This is not an argument, more like a near parochial meander, I guess. But
Can you make it an argument?
Yeah, I don't want to assign myself to the argument form of this, but it's something I wonder about when I read this stuff. You had a line that was kind of almost like a laugh, throwaway line about how he did all this work to create a universal theory of photography to justify generating interest in his own body of work. So I just wonder if you can elaborate on that slightly from the angle of it does seem, as someone who seems interested in pedagogy, like a kind of ethical problem to develop a methodology that is purely inductive based on one's own work, and as you say, uses students as guinea pigs and so on and so on. But this is a person who clearly cares about teaching, but as you say, he doesn't even know what he wants to teach on some level. So that's why it's not an argument or a question, but I just wonder if you can just expand a little bit.
No, I think there are some pretty real ethical issues that you get into with White as a teacher. I mean, he's trying to figure out on the fly what it means to teach photography in a college setting in the first place, plus he's got all of this, right, deeply philosophical or psychobabblish stuff he's trying to layer into that process, and he's really, right, is he hands-on or is he hands-off? He's kind of both of those things at the same time. He gets really involved in people's personal lives. He's always got some sort of cohort of people following him from place to place. I think ethics is a pretty good question to ask there, and some of the answers are actually a little uncomfortable at times. Right, and then that idea of the total theory, right, I feel like he grabs that early on, right, and I think some of that, right, whatever the explanations are, it's overdetermined. There's more than one factor. I think some of that is queerness, and some of that is real insider access, and some of that is probably the interaction between those two. The sense of having some kind of self that couldn't be spoken out loud, right? I mean, his sexuality was an open secret with everybody who knew him on a day-to-day basis, but it's also what gets him fired in 1952, right? Right, and somebody who so early in their career is connected to Adams and Weston and Newhall and Bernice, I mean, like all of the central players, right? It's Weston who tells him that he should number his negatives and start keeping proof cards, and I think it's one of the Newhalls who tells him he should be keeping carbon copies of all of his letters because a bunch of nerds are going to want to read this stuff in 2018, right? He's got this really weird, extraordinary insider access for somebody who also doesn't fit. And so I want to try to tack on a thought I didn't quite get formulated as Todd was finishing speaking, thinking about the way you're starting to line up Bart and White as sort of post-war figures, and I can't wait to see where you go with this. I have always thought of Roland Barthes' book, Camera Lucida, it's one of the kind of classroom classics on photography at this point, as a book that is fundamentally about the private experience of the public photograph. Right, Bart is primarily reading this landscape of media images, of mass media photographs, I mean, Avedons and magazines, stuff like that, right, and finding a way to read himself into those pictures in spite of the fact that they come from a world that tells him he shouldn't exist. And in some ways, White's inversion of that is always trying to build the public experience of the private photograph, right? To take something that's really about deep experience, inner identity, conflict, discomfort. I mean, the man was not comfortable in his skin from day one to day last, and turn that into something that can kind of go travel safely in the world out there. And I think I'm sort of seeing for the first time, hearing stuff today, right? The private experience of the public photograph and the public experience of the private photograph are both fundamentally about queerness when you look at where White and Bart are coming from, right? That's like a huge just part of, right, reading yourself into a world that doesn't make a place for you, or rebuilding a world that starts to make, like, it's, yeah, that's as far as I can verbalize the thought, but there's something there that we will hopefully get to hear more about in the very near future.
I think the one question I think is a technical question.
Yeah.
That is as a technical photographer and trained in the zone system, looking at the printing of his photographs is difficult in technology. And I think that that time, a lot of those people couldn't get their stuff printed the way they wanted to. They were so technical in the curves that they were trying to achieve that when they were printed in their printed form, they just didn't go. And so you're right in your aperture analogy, because we read that in photo history.
Yep.
Those are just examples that's the best they could get at that time to show you what it looked like. So when I, as a photo major, saw that, but when I went to see Adams's or Miner's originals, that's a whole different theory.
Yeah.
Okay, you're just looking at what he's interpreting, saying this is what we see as an image of this big, but when you get there and look at it, it's a whole different image of that. And that curve technology is really an issue, and I don't think it's ever been resolved at this point. So the Japanese printing technology is much more advanced than our technology in printing those curves, but it's really hard to do that. And so accepting that and printing that book of those images, like you're saying, those other images, it's going to be a hard process.
Yeah, and I think he stomachs enough of that to get ideas out in press, but that may be another thing on this list of challenges that gets in the way of the book, the sort of magnum opus. Yeah. Yeah, and ultimately the encounter he wanted you to have with his photographs was you in a room in complete silence for 2 or 3 hours, and then maybe after that you'd have something to talk about. Another one.
I was a photo major also, but I'm also a printer, a journeyman printer. And what we could make happen with photographs where we were trying to get those full zones, what we could make happen on a process camera to go onto a printed page, what we could do at the end of my active career with Photoshop and digital stuff were a whole different world. So my question is, I wonder if he would have actually printed the book, if he could have done it with digital printing, where there was so much more control of especially shadows and those darker, the heavier midtones.
It's a lovely thought, and there are a couple people in the room who know how to pull the strings on that kind of thing. We can, I won't make Kate talk about this while the mic's turned on, but we can think about permissions later. Thanks again, everybody.